find in the Bible. I also care very much about what the Bible says about marriage. That's kind of my main focus right now. And I decided that I would do a few segments in this Does the Bible Tell You So series about this idea, right? So what I'm going to do for the next few videos is address the 4 primary ideas that are usually associated with a label, that label biblical marriage. So there are actually 4 passages that help to define what people mean when they say biblical marriage. And so I want to look at what those ideas are and the passages that are used to underscore that idea. And then I'm also going to look a little bit more broadly in relation to that particular idea, right? So 4 passages. I'll do the first one today. The 4 passages are, in case you're curious, Genesis 1:28, Genesis 2:24, yes, just single verses, Matthew 19:4-6, and Ephesians 5:31 and 32. Those 4 passages, a total of 7 verses from the entire Bible, essentially underscore and define a particular way of talking about marriage for people today. So the first one, Genesis 1:28, is basically saying that procreation is for marriage, or one of the purposes of marriage is procreation, depending on which way you want to look at that. So I want to look at that. I'm going to look at it briefly, kind of a little bit more in context, and then I want to talk about this idea of saying that procreation is for marriage. Okay? So here we go. Beginning of, well, I'm going to read parts of Genesis 1. I'm not going to read the whole chapter. In fact, I did that in my other series, looking at doing story time. So let's look at the beginning and parts of Genesis chapter 1, enough to get to the leading up to the part that's important for us today. So at the very beginning of Genesis 1, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, and a wind from God, or the Spirit of God, depending on how you want to look at that, swept over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, Kara Lila. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And then we get the second day, where God talks about the dome in the midst of the waters, separating the waters from the waters, and then that God does that, sees that it's good, evening and morning the second day. Third day, God says, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear," and so forth, and then brings forth plants. So that's all day 3. Day 4, let the lights in the dome of the sky separate. So we have moon, sun, and stars. Day 5, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky. They really did think about the heaven, the what we stratosphere, all the different spheres that we know of. They really did think of it as a dome. It's really interesting how anyway, it's just a different way of thinking about it. So God created the sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." Does that mean that God was telling them to get married? Just so we're clear. Telling them to go be fruitful and multiply? Like, do birds get married? Are they married? No, in fact, we actually make a big deal of birds that mate for life, don't we? Like, oh, that's impressive. They stick with the same, or is it not? Or is it, it's really interesting, actually, right? There are a handful of birds that do mate for life, right? We kind of like to point that out for some reason. So, or is he telling all the fish in the sea to get married? Because he's telling them to be fruitful and multiply. I just need to be clear about this, right? Okay. I'll let you think about that. Right? And so there was evening and there was morning the 5th day. And then the next day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God spoke and it was. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps on the ground. God saw that it was good. And then God said in the same day, we haven't wrapped up the day yet, right? "Let us Make humankind in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and all the wild animals. So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, at the same time. God created them. God blessed them and said to them, just like God had blessed the animals in the seas and the birds of the air. So God is saying, right, to all the things that were created in this day, right, all the animals, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Was that just to the humans, or was that to all the creatures that were alive at that point? Because he blesses the water creatures and the birds on day 5. So is the blessing and telling them to be fruitful, multiply, is that for all the animals? Or does God not actually want all the animals to be fruitful and multiply, but just the human animals? When he says to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over these things, and I've given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, that's your food. Even for the animals, that's your food. Vegetables. And it was so, and God saw that everything that God had made, God saw everything that God had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was an evening and there was a morning the 6th day. So here's my premise, the premise for you on this one. Where in here are we talking about marriage? Where in this story is there anything to do with marriage? Now, if you think about two humans having children, and you think immediately that means we're talking about marriage, that's because you've been taught to think about it that way. But that isn't what this story is talking about. Genesis 1 is just talking about populating the planet. Everybody just, the fecundity of the planet, and everybody get busy doing your thing. Not that anyone had to be told to get busy making babies, right? None of the fish needed to be told to go do that thing where you lay the eggs in a string, and the dude is going to come along and fertilize it. Go do that thing. Nobody had to tell them to do that. Nobody had to tell the sea turtles to go crawl up on land and dig a hole for your babies. Nobody told them, right? It's just part of what they knew to do. So when we look at 128 and we say, this is God telling humans in a marriage what to do, we're very much reading out of context. Very much reading out of context. There is no wedding that takes place. There's no reference to humans pairing off and starting their own families. That's in the next chapter, right? Is this talking about humans being fruitful and multiplying? Well, of course it is. Does that require a male and a female? Absolutely. Unless we won't talk about Jesus right now. Yeah, sure. But that doesn't mean that we're talking about marriage. When you say that procreation is for marriage, you are disrespecting what this passage is actually talking about, it seems to me. It's also a really interesting thing when we look at two other stories that follow this. So very briefly, I'd like to direct your attention to what happens in chapter 16 of Genesis. Sarai, Abram's woman, had borne him no children. So she had this Egyptian woman that they had been given. They had procured a human, right, enslaved peoples when they were in Egypt, according to the storyline. And one of those people was a woman named Hagar. And Sarai, basically in a state of concern, because they had this promise that she was supposed to produce children and give him a multitude of descendants, she turns to him and says, look, the Lord has prevented me from having children, so why don't you go have sex with a slave girl that we brought back from Egypt, as people do. This is true. I'm not mocking this part. I'm saying this is actually what people do. It may be that she's the one who... It may be that I shall obtain children by her. In other words, this isn't something Sarah made up. This is a practice that was already out there. That you took the children from the union between the master and the enslaved person, And if you wanted to, you could make that child yours or part of the official family. If you didn't want to, you didn't have to. What's interesting to me is the parallel to enslavement and people who were enslaved on this continent, and how the children that came from men raping enslaved women were sometimes owned and brought in as a part of the family, and sometimes were disowned as if they were trash or, not my child. So it's important to me that people know or respect the fact that Sarah isn't making this up. This was a cultural practice. And there is procreation that is happening that is not between the husband and wife in their language, in their roles. It's not between Abraham and Sarah. It's between Abraham and one of the enslaved peoples in their homes. And so, yes, that does constitute rape in our case, in our language about things. But there is procreation that's happening that is not a part of the marriage between two people. It is procreation that's being respected as legit. But she's not married to him. She's just a slave girl, enslaved woman. And then the other story that's very important to me for you to consider, my cat is having a hard time waiting for me to go feed her, is when we look over at Jacob's story in chapter 29 and 30 of Genesis. And it's not Jacob's story in this case. I'd like you to think about Bilhah and Zilpah and Leah and Rachel. But at the beginning of chapter 30 of Genesis, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister, and she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die." And Jacob became angry with Rachel and said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? It's not my fault, it's God's fault that you can't bear children." Interesting how people still think about uteruses that way and women's ability to get pregnant, as if God intervenes in every single instance. This is perhaps one of the reasons people think that way today. I don't know. Then she said, "Here's my maid Bilhah." Okay, well, maid in this translation is not quite right. It's my enslaved woman Bilhah. She belongs to me. She was part of my dowry. Go into her that she may bear upon my knees, and that I too may have children through her. Same thing that Sarah was saying. They're not making this up. This is a part of the culture, okay? And there is procreation that is happening. Sure, it's going to go to this couple over here, who is one of two in the family, by the way. Jacob is married in our language to Leah and to Rachel. But Bilhah and Zilpah are both forced to procreate with Jacob, but they are not his wives. Okay? So biblical marriage, saying that the claim that biblical marriage tells us that procreation is for marriage, is actually false. That is not a true claim about what the Bible says to us about procreation. It's a thing that needed to happen, and couples did whatever they needed to in terms of surrogacy, and it was all in the family, right? It's all taken in or not. Sometimes they're disowned when it was no longer needed. So it's not fair. It is somewhat infuriating to me when someone makes a claim that the Bible says this when it does not. Genesis 1:28 is not talking about marriage. It is talking about filling the planet, something we could probably stop being so good at. It's not talking about marriage. And the concept of procreating as if it needs to be a part of marriage, you're disrespecting what the story is doing. The animals were also told to be fruitful and multiply, but we don't think of them or put upon them that they are married. And I don't think that we should. They're just doing the thing that comes naturally, right? So procreation, marriages are supposed to be procreative. The flip side, saying that marriages are supposed to be about bringing forth children, that also gets people when you think about it, right? If people are not able to reproduce, does that make their marriages illegitimate? Does that mean they should stop having sex after a woman stops having her period? All these things about the intensity around what a biblical marriage is and will be. People want to have a biblical marriage, so they want to reproduce, because that's what reproduction happens in a marriage. That's fine. It's fine to be married and to reproduce, but that isn't what the Bible is saying in terms of what belongs in a marriage. That isn't what it's saying. So let's be honest about that part, okay? That's my thing. Let's be honest. Biblical marriages, procreation is not just happening within the marriage. Okay? I hope there's something helpful in here for you, and I will see you next time.